I'm going to say good morning and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gail Day. I am the Executive Manager at the Free Market Foundation. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Rex van Schalkwyk. Rex is a former judge of the Supreme Court of South Africa. He's been the chairman of the FMF's board since September 2020 and chairman of our Rule of Law Board of Advisors since 2015. Rex will be introducing you to our new chief executive. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you, Gail. It gives me pleasure to announce to the Free Market Foundation and to interested parties generally that David Ansara has agreed to join us as our new chief executive. This is a role in which I'm sure he will excel, as he has excelled in the other roles in which he has occupied over the past several years. I think, have got to know him best in his role as the chief executive of the Center for Risk Analysis, but perhaps not so much in that role as the role of the interviewer who always asks the right questions. Asking the right questions may sound like a trifling matter, but in fact, for those of us who've been in the law and those of us who've been in the business of interviewing others, especially for television and public consumption, it is evident how important it is to ask the right questions in order to solicit and elicit the right answers. David has the uncanny ability that he does not leave an essential question unasked. This also may sound like a matter of trifling importance, but it is critically important because how many of us have felt the frustration of seeing an interviewee being interviewed by a friendly interviewer when a variety of questions that prop up in one's own mind are never asked? And the reason why those questions are never asked is because it is a friendly interview, and the interview does not wish to disturb the interviewee in any way at all. David has the courage of his conviction. He's got the courage of his questions to know that the questions that he asks will be properly answered, will be fully answered, and that in obtaining the answers that he is seeking, he is satisfying the needs of his customers, who happen to be the viewers. This is a quality to which I will revert in a moment when I've dealt with what is essentially our new project under the leadership of David Ansara, and that is the project of the renewal of the Free Market Foundation. Now, every successful project, such as the Free Market Foundation, requires to re-look at itself from time to time to determine in what respects it could be improved and in what respects it requires to abandon some of its stale old ideas in favor of new and more dynamic ideas. We will undertake this process in due course, and this is part of the natural process of renewal of an organization such as ours. An essential thing to bear in mind about the Free Market Foundation is, although we call ourselves the Free Marketeers, the Free Market Foundation, our essential commitment is towards the freedom or the liberty of the individual. That is classical liberalism in the sense in which it was first espoused by the philosopher John Locke and subsequently by many others. In pursuing that objective, we pursue a larger issue than simply the freedom to trade freely without let or hindrance. As Murray Rothbard has written, the principle of individual liberty extends to the principle of freedom of trade. It extends to the principle of freedom of possession. It extends to the principle of ownership of yourself, and because you own yourself, you own that which you produce. All of these are issues that are of critical importance to the Free Market Foundation and will remain so. However, there is an issue. In fact, there are two issues that have sullied the waters to quite a significant extent over the past several years. And the first of these two issues is one that occurred with the advent of the coronavirus event. What we saw at the time when that issue was triggered was an almost unanimous and complete abandonment of the principles of liberalism, of classical liberalism, around the liberal democratic world. And they did so almost in unison, almost as though it was done by text. Now, we've all experienced that, and I'm not going to revisit the abuses that took place during the course of that event. But the abuses did occur, and they occurred at the hands of governments and institutions which we were confident were committed fully to the principle of liberal democracy. Now, one of the consequences of this event is that although the crisis, as it was called, has receded into the distant past, the abuses that were undertaken by various governments have not receded into the distant past, but a flavor of those abuses, of that authoritarianism, remains still to this day. Now, there is another issue which we are going to have to be addressing in the process of renewal of the Free Market Foundation, and that is the issue of the corruption of the principles of universities. That is, the principles by which universities have conducted themselves throughout the ages until the second half of the 20th century. And from then onwards, we saw a gradual decline in essentially the commitment towards academic freedom. And academic freedom in this broader sense comprehends also the freedom of the individual to freely express himself and to disagree when necessary. We know that universities throughout the world, and prominent universities, some of the very best of universities, have led the way towards what can only be described as a form of neo-Marxism. And it is not merely the neo-Marxist philosophy that underlies this principle, but also the destruction of individual liberty that underlies this principle. So we at the Free Market Foundation now find ourselves isolated to an extent. In the past, although we were fighting a noble battle on behalf of a noble cause here in South Africa, we thought to ourselves, and we believed, that we had at least the support, the moral support, if nothing else, of the vast majority of countries which call themselves liberal democracies, the countries of the West. I'm afraid we're in the process of losing that support. And the issue that we're going to have to confront with the renewal of the Free Market Foundation is not whether we reassess our values or whether there's something wrong with our values. There's absolutely nothing wrong with our values. But how do we remain effective in the face of the onslaught that is undoubtedly coming our way? Not specifically our way, but the way of people with a similar philosophy to the philosophy that we have. Now, this is where David's ability to ask always the right question comes into the picture. Because when he joins us as our new chief executive, he will be expected to ask the right questions of us. And when I say he is expected to ask the right questions of us, I mean that he will be expected to ask difficult questions of us, questions that we may even find very difficult, if not impossible, immediately to answer. But in doing so, he will be exploring avenues for action in the future about how best to remain relevant, that is to say, relevant to our liberal democratic principles based upon classical liberal principles. So long as we remain true to those principles, we can be sure that we will be in a position to play a constructive role in the future. But this process of renewal, which David is undoubtedly going to lead when he joins us, will be an essential part of that process. David, you're very welcome to join the Free Market Foundation. I am very gratified that you've decided to join us, and I'm convinced that your tenure at the Free Market Foundation will be a very successful one. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rex, for those incredibly kind words. And yes, I've made it my business over the last few years to ask the right questions, the difficult questions. But I also think that something that appeals to me about the Free Market Foundation is that it has been for the last 47 years providing answers to some of the more intractable policy and political and economic questions in South Africa, and played a critical role during the 1980s in arguing for reform and liberalization of South Africa's markets, and has for many decades played an outstanding role. But as you say, the organization has perhaps lost a bit of strategic focus and is in need of renewal. And it is an awesome responsibility that you have bestowed upon me, both yourself as chairman, as well as the other members of the Free Market Foundation. And it is a challenge that I relish and that I'm going to give 100% of my energy to. So I am incredibly grateful for the trust that you have invested in me. But I think there's a lot of hard work to be done. And I think if we look around in South Africa today, the case for liberty, for free markets, for economic freedom has never been greater. We have a number of threats that are facing core pillars of the classical liberal tradition, including to property rights. Private property rights really is the foundation of economic activity. And before the National Council of Provinces, we now have the expropriation bill, which will seek to dilute private property rights. The rule of law has also been tested, and you as a retired judge and a legal scholar and as the leader of the Rule of Law Board of Advisors will know this very well, Rex. But the ability to hold elites to account, to administer justice fairly and judiciously, no matter how much power you have, every individual is endowed with legal rights in this country, and the Free Market Foundation has played a critical role in defending those rights. It's often attributed to Thomas Jefferson that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and an organization like the Free Market Foundation is one of the watchmen of our democratic system. And it is worth building and investing time, energy, and resources in. And I'm very excited about next year when I will commence my role. And I also think the Free Market Foundation is going to play a critical role in advocating for the role of the private sector, of free enterprise. Growth is the greatest engine of transformation in society. Often hear that word transformation, but we don't focus enough, I think, on the power of growth to transform individuals' lives. And in many respects, what we have in South Africa is the country of two nations. Thabo Mbeki once gave his famous two nations speech where he said there was one nation that was white and prosperous and another that was black and poor. That is no longer the case today. We have a multiracial middle class that has been the beneficiaries of growth. But we also have a number of many millions of poor people who are dependent on the state for welfare. They are locked out of labor markets because of our rigid labor regulatory framework. So in many respects, we do have two South Africas. But the first is a bureaucratic and political elite that has benefited from its access to public resources and is essentially an extractive class. The other South Africa is the nation of entrepreneurs, of hustlers, of go-getters, of people who are trying to make ends meet, who are trying to improve themselves and the circumstances of their families. And in many respects, that is the nation of South Africa that we see ourselves as representing at the Free Market Foundation. We understand the power of markets to drive prosperity and growth. And the finance minister gave his medium-term budget policy statement last week, and he indicated that over the medium term, South Africa is set to grow at a paltry 1.6%. That just simply isn't good enough. We need a fundamental overhaul of our political institutions and the way that markets operate in South Africa. And I see the FMF as being a key actor on the front lines of that battle. And I use that term battle very specifically. The FMF has a number of scholarly people who like to think deeply, long and hard about the problems facing South Africa. But we are also engaged in essentially a contest for power and a contest around the direction of South Africa. So the battle of ideas is really where we as the FMF need to be involving ourselves. That is what the Institute of Race Relations has done, where I've been for several years, and I think we can point there to a number of successes. So I want to take some of the lessons that I've learned from that experience over the last 4 years with the Institute and take them on to this new chapter. So I just want to say a special thanks to you, Rex, for leading this appointment process, but also to Gail Day I think she has been very instrumental in getting us to this point. So I wanted to say a very special thank you to her. And also a thank you to my erstwhile colleagues at the Institute. I leave with something of a heavy heart because I've built many professional and personal relationships there at the Institute. I've been enormously proud of the work that we have done there, both for our clients, but also in the broader public domain in South Africa. So I leave with a heavy heart, but also a full heart, knowing that I have experienced a lot of intellectual development and growth in that role. But I look forward to applying those skills and that energy to this new role. And I look forward to taking the Free Market Foundation to new heights.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to you, Rex. We're really looking forward to having you on board, David, and it'll be our New Year's resolution to renew ourselves with you on board. If anybody has any questions, you can either type them into Q&A, or if you raise your hand, I can just give you access to speak directly to either David or Rex. I'll just give people a couple of minutes to do some typing or to come up with a question that they would like to ask David. I was speaking to you earlier about the importance of think tanks. You know, what is the relevance of a think tank in a sort of changing world? I know that in America, think tanks are very highly regarded. In South Africa, a little less. And perhaps you'd like to just touch on the relevance and role of think tanks in a society.
Well, look, I think in a developed world context like the United States, where there's perhaps deeper pools of funding and a kind of longer tradition of think tanks, and also very specific kind of institutional arrangements that allow think tanks to happen, the work there is quite different. You can maybe afford to be spending long hours locked away in your office writing policy papers or periodicals, journal articles, and so on. I think that's very important for sharpening your analysis, for getting really deep and into the root of a social problem in a complex society. But in the South African context, there's also, as I mentioned, this watchman role that think tanks can play, that your research is not just an end in itself, it's a tool for you to argue for a greater openness or liberalization as an instrument for promoting prosperity and making the case for capitalism in South Africa. I think capitalism, for some reason, is seen as a dirty word, but capitalism is the greatest engine of human prosperity and development that we've ever seen. So, I think think tanks play a critical role. They're not just lobby organizations. You need to have that scholarly integrity. Your research needs to be watertight. But then you must think about, how could you instrumentalize that research to achieve positive outcomes in society?
Thank you, David. I have a couple of questions. Alison McDonald asks, what is going to be your first order of business at the FMF?
Thanks very much, Alison. Well, I think the first order of business will actually be internal. So I need to get my head around all of the internal systems. I have a particular vision for where I want the FMF to go. And that will require certain changes in terms of internal governance, internal management structure. At least for the time being, I see the FMF being a very lean and mean organization, very targeted, very specifically focused on economic policy and amplifying the case for individual liberty in the public domain. So that'll be the second pillar of my strategy, which is to develop a renewed public communications and public relations strategy for the FMF. And then, obviously funding is a very critical part of any civil society organization. So I'm going to be meeting with prospective donors, introducing myself, and also making the case for many people who have a vested interest in seeing South Africa grow and prosper to open their wallets and to assist us in our cause. So that is going to be first up on my agenda. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks, David. I have a question, a verbal question from Tim Kern. Tim, if you can just add, that's it.
Hi, David. Thanks. What you're saying is very interesting, of course. I just wonder how you think the FMF is seen by different slices of South African society. I mean, I do get the impression that the FMF is seen as kind of fringy, irrelevant, sort of an institution of the defense of white economic dominance in the society. What do you think your challenges are as far as the way that, what do you just think that how do you think the FMS is perceived by South Africans across the board?
Well, it may be perceived to be on the fringe because it doesn't make its business ingratiating itself with the political and intellectual class in South Africa. So like I suggested in my opening remarks, the FMF is really out there fighting for the little guy. And as I've explained, reducing barriers to trade, for example, defending street hawkers who might be harassed by metro cops on the sidewalks of downtown Joburg. That is something that perhaps is happening under the radar, very easy for the elites in society to perhaps look the other way. But the FMF has a long tradition of working with trader communities, for example, in townships, etc. And so very much sees itself as giving a voice to people who might not have the resources or the collective bargaining power to advocate for their cause. So, I think I'm pretty adamant that, it is both Black and white South Africans who will benefit from the rising tide that will lift the boats of the lives and the prosperity of all South Africans. So, look, people are free to have their own opinions, but we know what we're about. We know what work we have to do. We are not ignorant of the criticisms. We're not afraid of people criticizing us. The principles that we want to advance might attract some negative attention from others. That's not going to stop us from making the case forcefully and often for free markets and individual liberty in South Africa.
Thank you, David. Tim, would you like to add anything more?
No, that's fine. Thanks. Thanks for that answer. I'd like to investigate it a little bit further. I guess in the future we can chat about it more, I suppose.
Yeah, and Tim, I read your book on mining a few years ago, which I really enjoyed. I think it was called Another Piece of the Pie. And I thought, the mining industry, for example, is an area that is seen as part of the kind of legacy of the South African economy, that it benefited a very kind of narrow class. But now what we see is that the mining industry has effectively been strangled by regulation, by the dilution of its property rights, by a very coercive empowerment framework. And really, we're not yielding the benefits of that. So in that particular example, I would see the FMF as being a very important counterweight to some of the kind of radical policies that are being proposed in that specific industry, just by way of example.
Sure.
Thank you, Tim. David, I have another question. How does David believe a free market economy will benefit South Africa's poor?
Well, Friedrich Hayek once said that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to man how little they know about what they think they can design. And we have a lot of people in South Africa in government who see themselves as kind of the architects of the economy, sitting in a smokeless room in Pretoria, pulling the levers of the economy. I'm thinking of perhaps somebody like Minister Patel in the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Competition Commission is another one. And many of these people believe that they're acting in the best interests of the poor by supposedly creating more competition when actually they constrain the competitiveness of South Africa's economy. And so, you know, I kind of illustrate this as saying, well, we believe that poor South Africans, ordinary South Africans, have the ability to improve their own life circumstances. We believe that economic freedom is about people taking it upon themselves with the right opportunities, by the removal of impediments, to actually achieve great things for themselves and their families. And that requires a lot of hard work. With freedom comes responsibility as well. But our view is, you know, we're a small organization. We can use our lobbying power and our advocacy skills to remove the impediments that have been placed there, often by bureaucrats, government officials, and politicians, and the perverse incentives that characterize our current policy framework. So yeah, we're going to be using our magnifying lens, studying the policy framework, identifying where those blockages are, removing those, and then letting people get on with improving their own lives.
Thank you. I have a question from Schalkwyk at Engineering News. How could the new public-private development frameworks benefit the rights and power of the private sector? And how would that affect its role in society more broadly?
Look, I'm not very familiar with the technical specifics there, but you know, I think it was once very fashionable to talk about public-private partnerships, but often, you know, that saw the state still as the central actor. I think there are a lot of public-private partnerships that are happening by default in South Africa, where essentially the state apparatus is collapsing, it's incapacitated, and many ordinary South Africans are coming together to provide municipal services for example, where water reticulation or sewage systems have collapsed, people filling potholes in their local community. And, you know, unfortunately, the state has taken on so much power, and the more power it takes on, the less capable it becomes of actually delivering on its self-appointed mandate. So, you know, I think there is a great role for the private sector in filling the void that has been left by the capable state. You know, if I think of an organization like Sakiliga, they've done incredible work aggregating the kind of collective interests of small and medium-sized businesses in South Africa, and using that collective power to essentially solve many of the problems that have been created by the retreating state, or even been created by what is in many instances a malevolent state. So, you know, I think that is an emergent phenomenon that is happening in South Africa. I think that we need to recognize that and also embrace it.
Thank you, David.
Gail?
Yes.
Gail, I'd just like to add to what David has very competently set out. The observable fact that when the government resorts to private-public relationships of the kind that have been described, it does so only as a very last resort. It does so reluctantly, and it does so in the face of its own ideological commitment to the national democratic revolution, which, as we all know, is a Marxist-Leninist doctrine. So, for instance, we can take SAA by way of example. We can take Eskom by way of yet another example. We can take any number of institutions by way of example, and one will see that it is only when failure is absolutely assured that the government resorts to the idea of a partnership. And because it does so reluctantly, I fear that the role of the private sector will always be relegated under the ANC to that of a junior partner. And that is precisely where the ANC wants the private sector to be. It doesn't want it as an influential partner, but as a junior partner.
Thank you, Rex. Are there any other questions? I don't have anything more in Q&A, but perhaps somebody would like to ask something verbally. Just give you a minute to work out how to put up your hand if you'd like to do so. All right, there seem to be no other questions. Rex, would you like to just say a final word, and then perhaps David can close up?
Thank you, Gail. Well, my final word is to thank David for his very comprehensive and very able display of his knowledge and understanding of the principles that underlie the Free Market Foundation and how he intends to participate. It encourages me, although I've been encouraged throughout this whole process, but it encourages me even to a greater extent to hear David articulate the points of view that he's articulated this morning. I'm grateful to have participated in this process, and I'm very grateful for the fact that David has agreed to join us in the capacity of Chief Executive.
Well, thank you once again, Rex. Thank you, Gail. Yeah, I think that freedom is worth fighting for, and it's not going to happen on its own. You know, freedom requires constant vigilance, and I think that the Free Market Foundation has played a really critical role in entrenching the rights and freedoms of ordinary South Africans throughout the last 47 years. And I'm looking forward to the years ahead, where I hope to take the Free Market Foundation to a new level of performance and impact. And I'm very honored by the opportunity that has been presented to me, and very much aware of the burden and the responsibility that comes with that. But I'm very excited to be starting on 1 January and looking forward to many more future engagements like this.
Thank you very much indeed, David, and thank you to all of those who joined us today. Bye-bye.